My SIL said my deceased husband's dog was put down, until I found him alive in my backyard one night. The house felt too big after the funeral. The rooms echoed in ways they never had before, even though nothing had changed. The couch was in the same place. The photos still lined the wall. His boots were still by the door. Yet the silence pressed down on her chest every morning when she woke up, heavy and unmoving. Hit that subscribe button and tap the bell icon so you never miss our latest uploads. She moved through her days slowly, as if the world had thickened around her. Simple things took effort. Making tea. Opening the curtains. Answering messages she did not want to read. People kept saying the same words, telling her she was strong, that time would help, that she would be okay. She nodded when she was supposed to, but inside she felt hollow. At night, sleep came in short pieces. She would drift off for an hour, then wake suddenly, reaching out to the other side of the bed before remembering it was empty. That moment, when hope flickered and died again, hurt more than the waking hours. The only steady presence in the house was the dog. He was old now, his fur pale around the eyes, his steps slow and careful. 4 years, he had followed her husband everywhere, never more than a few steps behind. When her husband sat, the dog sat. When he stood, the dog stood. When he laughed, the dog wagged his tail as if he understood the joke. After the loss, the dog stayed close to her instead. He followed her from room to room, quiet and watchful. When she cried on the kitchen floor, he lowered himself beside her and rested his head against her leg. When she stared out the window for long stretches of time, he sat nearby, breathing softly, as if reminding her she was not alone. She talked to him in a low voice, telling him things she could not say to anyone else. She told him how much she missed his person, how unfair it all felt, how scared she was of the future. The dog listened without judgment, his cloudy eyes calm and patient. In him, she felt close to her husband again. Every scratch behind the ears reminded her of how her husband used to do it. Every slow walk around the block brought back memories of the two of them together, laughing when the dog refused to move, insisting on sniffing the same patch of grass for minutes at a time. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky orange, she sat on the porch steps with the dog leaning against her leg. She ran her hand through his fur and felt the steady rhythm of his breathing. "I'll take care of you," she whispered. "I promise." It felt important to say it out loud. That promise became her anchor. When her sister-in-law began visiting more often, the quiet balance of the house shifted. At first, the visits seemed kind. She brought food, folded laundry, and spoke in a soft voice that sounded concerned. She said she wanted to help, that family should stick together. The woman appreciated the company at first, even if it was draining. But small comments began to slip in. The sister-in-law would glance at the dog and sigh before saying things like, "He's getting so old," or, "That must be a lot of work for you now." Sometimes she added, "You should think about yourself too," with a tight smile. At first, the woman brushed it off. Everyone grieved differently, she told herself. Maybe the comments were just awkward attempts at care. But they continued. During one visit, the sister-in-law stood in the doorway watching the dog struggle slightly as he stood up. "You know," she said casually, "some people say holding on too long can make it harder to heal." The woman felt her stomach tighten. "He's not holding me back," she replied quietly. The sister-in-law raised her hands as if surrendering. "I'm just saying. You deserve a fresh start." The words "fresh start" echoed in the room long after the visit ended. Later that night, the woman sat on the floor with the dog and wrapped her arms around him. She pressed her face into his fur and breathed him in, grounding herself. "He doesn't understand," she murmured to the dog, though she wasn't sure if she meant herself or her sister-in-law. "We still have each other." The dog shifted slightly and let out a soft sound, as if agreeing. As days turned into weeks, the pressure grew more noticeable. The sister-in-law mentioned how expensive vet care could be. She brought up stories of people who had done the kind thing for aging pets. She talked about how hard it must be to watch an animal decline. Each comment landed like a stone. The woman began to feel defensive in her own home. She caught herself explaining the dog's routines, his appetite, his gentle nature, as if she needed permission to keep him. One afternoon, after the sister-in-law left, the woman felt overwhelmed. She sat at the kitchen table, staring at nothing, while the dog lay at her feet. "I'm not ready," she whispered. "I won't let anyone decide for us." She stood up and fetched the dog's leash, taking him for a walk even though her legs felt heavy. The cool air helped clear her thoughts. The dog walked slowly, but he walked with purpose, his head high. People passed them on the sidewalk, barely noticing. To the world, he was just an old dog. To her, he was a living memory, a piece of her heart that still beat outside her body. That night, she made a quiet decision. She would protect him. No matter what anyone says. No matter how uncomfortable the conversations became. No matter how much pressure came from outside voices. He had given his loyalty for years. Now it was her turn. As she turned off the lights and settled into bed, the dog curled up beside her. She rested her hand on his back and felt his steady breathing. The house was still quiet. The grief was still there. But in that moment, she felt a small sense of purpose. She closed her eyes, holding on to the promise she had made on the porch, unaware that the loyalty she offered would soon be tested in ways she never imagined. The afternoon began like many others since the loss, slow and heavy. The woman left the house with a small list in her pocket, planning to run a few errands. She hesitated at the door, looking back at the dog resting near the window. He lifted his head when he heard her keys and wagged his tail just once, careful not to move too much. "I'll be back soon," she said softly. She bent down, rubbed his head, and felt the familiar comfort of his presence. Then she left, unaware that the promise she had made to protect him was about to be tested in the cruelest way. While she was gone, the house did not stay empty for long. The sister-in-law arrived quietly, letting herself in with a spare key she still carried. She stood in the doorway for a moment, scanning the room. The dog looked at her, alert but calm, and slowly stood up. His tail wagged, unsure but hopeful. She did not return the warmth. Instead, she sighed and shook her head, as if confirming a decision already made. She spoke to the dog in a flat voice, telling him he looked tired, that he seemed unwell. The dog did not understand her words, only the tone. He lowered himself back onto the floor. She made a few phone calls, her voice firm and controlled. She told others in the family that the dog had taken a turn, that he was suffering, that something had to be done. She framed it as mercy, as responsibility, as something the woman was too emotional to handle. No one asked for proof. No one came to check. By the time the woman returned home later that day, the house felt different. The silence was sharper, more hollow. She called the dog's name out of habit as she set her bag down, expecting the soft sound of paws on the floor. Nothing came. Her chest tightened. She walked through the house, room by room, her heart pounding harder with each step. The dog's bed was still there, but it was empty. His bowl sat untouched. The leash hung by the door. Confusion turned to dread. That was when her phone rang. It was a family member, speaking carefully, as if choosing each word to avoid breaking something fragile. "I'm so sorry," the voice said. "We thought you knew." Knew what? The words that followed felt unreal. The dog had been put down. The sister-in-law said he was suffering. She said it was the kind thing to do. She said she was helping. The woman sank into a chair as the room spun around her. "No," she whispered. "No, that's not possible." Her thoughts raced. The dog had been fine that morning. Slow, yes. Old, yes. But still present. Still eating. Still wagging his tail. She ended the call and stared at the wall, trying to breathe. When the sister-in-law arrived later, she acted calm, almost relieved. She spoke gently, explaining her choice as if it were obvious. "I couldn't let him suffer," she said. "You weren't thinking clearly." The woman stood frozen, listening but not hearing. Her mind replayed the last moment she had seen the dog, alive and waiting for her to return. "You had no right," she finally said, her voice barely steady. The sister-in-law frowned. "I did what needed to be done." The betrayal hit harder than the loss itself. That night, the woman sat alone in the backyard. The space where the dog used to lie felt painfully empty. Every sound seemed louder without the soft rhythm of his breathing. She wrapped her arms around herself, shaking. The promise she had made echoed in her mind. And for the first time since her husband's death, her grief turned into something else entirely. The days after felt blurred together, as if time had lost its shape. The woman moved through the house without purpose, touching familiar objects only to remind herself they were still real. The dog's bed stayed where it was. She could not bring herself to move it. Each time she passed by, her chest tightened, and she felt the urge to call out, even though she knew there would be no answer. People checked in on her. Messages came in waves, full of sympathy and careful words. She replied when she could, often with short answers. Talking felt exhausting. Explaining felt impossible. At night, the quiet was unbearable. She lay awake listening to the sounds of the house, expecting to hear the dog shift in his sleep or scratch lightly at the door. The absence was loud. It filled every corner of the room and left her restless and aching. At first, she accepted the story she had been told because the pain was too heavy to carry anything else. But grief has a way of loosening things over time. Small thoughts began to surface, uninvited and unsettling. She remembered how the dog had eaten his breakfast that morning before she left. Slowly, yes, but with interest. She remembered the way he wagged his tail when she picked up her keys. The way his eyes followed her, calm and trusting. That memory would not leave her. She tried to push it aside, telling herself she was clinging to hope because the truth hurt too much. Still, the thought returned again and again. Something didn't fit. During a family call a few days later, the sister-in-law repeated her version of events. She spoke confidently, listing symptoms the dog supposedly showed. Trouble standing. No appetite. Clear signs, she said. The woman listened quietly, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Trouble standing? Yes, the dog was slow, but he had always been careful. No appetite. That part caught her attention. She clearly remembered refilling his bowl that morning. She remembered the soft sound of him eating while she packed her bag. When she asked gently about the timing, the sister-in-law hesitated for just a second too long. It all happened so fast, she said. You know how these things go. The answer felt empty. After the call ended, the woman sat alone, staring at her phone. Her heart was pounding, not with anger yet, but with confusion. She began replaying conversations in her mind. The comments about burden. The talks about cost. The reminders about moving on. At the time, they had felt uncomfortable but harmless. Now they felt heavier. She walked into the backyard that evening, standing where the dog used to lie in the shade. The grass was flattened in the shape of his body, still holding the outline of where he liked to rest. Her throat tightened. He wasn't ready, she whispered. But she had no proof. That was the hardest part. Doubt without evidence felt like betrayal of its own kind. She questioned herself constantly. Was she imagining things? Was grief making her unreasonable? Some family members seemed eager to move on. They spoke about the dog as if he had been a problem solved rather than a life lost. They told her she should focus on healing, on herself, on the future. Each time, something inside her recoiled. Healing did not feel possible when the truth felt incomplete. Late one afternoon, she opened a drawer and found the dog's vet papers. She had not looked at them in weeks. Her hands shook slightly as she spread them out on the table. The last visit showed nothing urgent. Notes mentioned age, stiffness, routine care. No warnings. No serious concerns. She stared at the pages, her mind racing. If he had been so sick, why hadn't anyone called her first? Why was there no record? Questions piled up, each one pressing harder than the last. Still, she said nothing. Confrontation felt dangerous without certainty. Accusations could break what little family support she had left. And deep down, part of her feared the answer. What if the truth was worse than she imagined? That night, she sat on the edge of her bed, holding the dog's old collar in her hands. She rubbed her thumb over the worn fabric, remembering how it used to jingle softly when he walked. "I trusted you," she said quietly, though she wasn't sure who she was speaking to anymore. The grief was no longer soft. It was sharp now. Mixed with doubt, it refused to settle. She lay down and stared at the ceiling, realizing that while the house had lost a dog, she might have lost something else as well. Her sense of safety. Her trust. And somewhere deep inside, a quiet resolve began to form. She didn't know what she would find. But she knew she could not let the questions rest. The nights had become the hardest part of the day. Darkness settled over the house like a heavy blanket, pressing in on her thoughts. During the day, she could distract herself with small tasks. At night, there was nothing to hide behind. Every memory felt louder. Every doubt felt closer. That evening, she sat on the couch with the lights low, staring at nothing in particular. The television was on, but she wasn't watching it. The sound played softly in the background, filling space without meaning. Outside, the backyard was still. Or so she thought. At first, the sound was faint. A soft scrape, almost like branches brushing against the fence. She barely noticed it, assuming it was the wind or a stray animal passing through. She muted the television. The sound came again. Scrape. Pause. Scrape. Her stomach tightened. She sat very still, listening. The noise was slow and uneven, not frantic, but deliberate. Claws, maybe. Or paws. "Just your imagination," she whispered. Grief did strange things to the mind. She knew that. She had read about it. Heard people talk about it. How loss could create sounds that weren't there. Shapes in the dark. Familiar feelings where nothing existed. Still, she stood up. The house creaked softly as she moved toward the back door. With each step, her heart beat faster. She pressed her ear closer to the glass. The sound was clearer now. Digging. Her breath caught in her throat. Then she heard it. A low, broken sound. Soft. Weak. A whine. Her knees nearly gave out. "No," she said out loud. "No, no, no." Her hands shook as she reached for the flashlight by the door. For a moment she hesitated, afraid of what she might find. Afraid of hoping. Afraid of being wrong. But the sound came again. There was no mistaking it. She opened the door. Cool night air rushed in, carrying the smell of dirt and grass. The backyard looked normal at first glance, quiet and still under the dim porch light. Then the flashlight beam moved. The ground near the old tree was disturbed. Fresh soil piled unevenly, darker than the rest of the yard. The earth looked recently turned, as if something had been working its way upward. Her chest burned as she took a step forward. Another whine rose from the ground. Familiar. Painfully familiar. Her vision blurred as tears filled her eyes. "It can't be," she whispered. She moved closer, the flashlight shaking in her hand. The sound came again, followed by a faint movement beneath the dirt. Something shifted. Something alive. Her mind raced. If she was wrong, she would feel foolish. Broken. Lost to grief. If she was right. She dropped to her knees. The soil was loose. She dug with her hands, not caring about the dirt under her nails or the cold biting into her skin. Her breathing came in sharp bursts as panic and hope tangled together. "Please," she whispered. "Please." The dirt gave way more easily than she expected. Another whine. Closer now. Her heart felt like it might tear itself apart. She brushed the soil aside, working faster, fear pushing her forward. Her hands trembled as they touched something warm. Fur. She froze. Then the fur moved. A weak but unmistakable movement pressed against her fingers. She let out a sound that was half sob, half gasp. "Oh my God," she breathed. The flashlight beam caught a familiar shape. A familiar face. Dirt-covered, tired, but alive. The dog. He looked up at her, his eyes cloudy but focused. His tail moved slightly, a small effort that said everything words could not. She laughed and cried at the same time, her hands shaking as she cleared the dirt away from him. She spoke his name over and over, her voice breaking with each repetition. "I'm here," she said. "I've got you. I'm here." The dog let out a soft sound, leaning into her touch. The world seemed to stop. The silence that had haunted the backyard for days shattered in that moment, replaced by something impossible. Life. She wrapped her arms around him carefully, afraid to hurt him, afraid he might disappear if she let go. His body was thin and tired, but real. Solid. Warm. Her promise echoed loudly in her mind. "I'll take care of you." She looked around the yard, her tears drying as shock settled in. Someone had buried him here. Alive. The thought sent a chill through her body that had nothing to do with the cold night air. As she held him close, relief slowly gave way to something darker. The doubt she had carried was no longer quiet. It had a voice now, and it was demanding answers. For a moment, she could only kneel there, frozen in disbelief. The dog stood in front of her, trembling slightly, his fur matted with dirt. His paws scraped weakly at the ground, as if he had been digging long before she ever heard him. When he saw her clearly, his whole body shifted. His ears lifted. His eyes widened. Recognition. He let out a sound that broke something open inside her. It was the same sound he had always made when she came home late. Soft. Relieved. Full of trust. She dropped fully to her knees then, the flashlight falling onto the grass beside her. She reached out, afraid to scare him, afraid he might vanish if she moved too fast. "It's me," she whispered. "It's okay. I'm here." The dog took a step toward her. Then another. His tail wagged weakly but steadily, brushing against the dirt behind him. He pressed his head into her chest, breathing fast, as if trying to make sure she was real. She wrapped her arms around him and held him close. Her whole body shook. "He said you were gone," she murmured. "They all said you were gone." The dog didn't understand the words, but he understood the touch. He leaned into her, exhausted, trusting her completely. Relief crashed over her like a wave. He was alive. Not sick. Not suffering. Not gone. Alive. The weight that had been crushing her chest for days lifted all at once, leaving her gasping for breath. She laughed through her tears, pressing her face into his dirty fur, not caring about anything except the warmth beneath her hands. "I found you," she said over and over. "I found you." But as the relief settled, something else rose to take its place. Questions. She looked around the yard, her heart still racing. The fence line. The disturbed soil. The spot where he had clearly been left behind. Not buried carefully. Not cared for. Abandoned. Dumped like he didn't matter. The truth landed slowly, but when it did, it hit hard. He had never been put down. The story she had been told was a lie. Her hands tightened slightly in his fur, careful not to hurt him. Her mind raced back through every conversation, every calm explanation, every look of false sympathy. The sister-in-law hadn't acted out of mercy. She had acted out of convenience. Anger surged through her, sharp and sudden. It mixed with the relief until she could barely tell where one ended and the other began. Her heart pounded, not with fear now, but with fury. "How could anyone do this to you?" she whispered. The dog looked up at her, dirt clinging to his face, his eyes still gentle despite everything. He licked her hand weakly, as if comforting her instead. That small gesture broke her all over again. She pulled him closer and took a deep breath, forcing herself to slow down. Rage could come later. Right now, he needed her. She stood carefully, keeping one arm around him for support. His legs shook, but he stayed upright, leaning into her strength. Inside the house, the lights were still on. The same house where she had been told he was gone forever. The same house where she had cried herself to sleep believing a lie. As she guided him toward the door, her relief hardened into resolve. Someone had tried to erase him. Someone had lied to her face. And someone was going to answer for it. She closed the door behind them, locking it firmly, as if sealing the truth inside with them. The impossible had happened. The dog was home. And nothing would ever be the same again. Morning came slowly, weighed down by everything the night had revealed. The woman barely slept. She sat on the couch with the dog curled beside her, her hand resting on his back, rising and falling with each breath. Every few minutes, she checked him again, as if afraid he might disappear the moment she looked away. But he stayed. Alive. Warm. Real. As daylight filled the room, the shock began to settle, replaced by clarity. The fear had passed. The doubt was gone. What remained was the truth. She made the call shortly after sunrise. When the sister-in-law arrived, she looked surprised to see the dog. For a brief second, the careful mask slipped. Her eyes widened. Her mouth opened slightly, then closed again. "You said he was gone," the woman said calmly. The sister-in-law recovered quickly. I didn't think." "Sit down," the woman said. Her voice was steady in a way it hadn't been for weeks. The dog lifted his head, alert but quiet, watching the exchange. The woman rested a hand on his shoulder, grounding herself. The sister-in-law sighed and sank into a chair. "I did what I thought was best," she said. "You weren't thinking clearly. You were too attached." The woman nodded slowly. "Tell me the truth," she said. "All of it." Silence stretched between them. Finally, the sister-in-law looked away. "I never took him anywhere," she admitted. "I couldn't deal with it. The cost. The time. Watching him get worse." Her words came faster now, defensive. "So I drove him out of town. Far enough that he wouldn't come back. I assumed that he wouldn't survive," the woman finished. The sister-in-law didn't deny it. The room felt cold. "You abandoned him," the woman said quietly. "I was trying to help," the sister-in-law snapped. "Someone had to make the hard choice." The woman looked down at the dog, who leaned closer to her leg, trusting as ever. "This," she said, gesturing gently toward him, "was not a hard choice. It was cruelty pretending to be kindness." The sister-in-law crossed her arms. "You're overreacting." "No," the woman replied. "I was grieving. You took advantage of that." The truth sat heavily in the air. There were no raised voices. No dramatic gestures. Just the quiet collapse of excuses. The sister-in-law stood abruptly. "I thought you'd thank me," she muttered. The woman met her eyes. "You lied to me. You stole something that mattered. And you nearly cost him his life." The sister-in-law had no answer. She left soon after, the door closing behind her with a final hollow sound. The woman sank back onto the couch, exhaustion washing over her. The dog climbed up beside her, pressing his head against her arm. "I see it now," she whispered. "All of it." The truth had come out. And with it, the last of her denial disappeared. What had been done could not be undone. But it would not be ignored. She held the dog close, knowing that while the truth had brought pain, it had also brought strength. And this time, she would decide what came next. The days that followed were not quiet, but they were clear. The woman moved with purpose for the first time in weeks. Grief was still there, sitting heavy in her chest, but it no longer controlled her. She had something else guiding her now. Protection. The first thing she did was make sure the dog was safe. She carried him into the car carefully, supporting his weight, speaking to him the whole way. He stayed close, trusting her completely, even as the world outside the window rushed past. At the vet's office, she waited with him on the floor, her hand never leaving his back. The checkup took time. Tests were done. Notes were taken. The verdict was clear. He was weak, dehydrated, tired. But he was not dying. He had never been. The relief she felt was mixed with anger all over again. Still, she thanked the staff, followed every instruction, and took him home with a careful plan for recovery. Back at the house, she wrote everything down. Dates, times, conversations she could remember, messages that had been sent, things that had been said in passing and later denied. She saved photos. She kept records. She didn't do it out of revenge. She did it out of responsibility. The dog slept deeply that night, safe at last. She watched him from the couch, listening to his steady breathing, and felt something settle inside her. She had chosen correctly. The family calls started soon after. Some were gentle. Others were not. They told her she should let it go. That everyone was hurting. That holding on to anger would only make things worse. They said forgiveness would bring peace. She listened without interrupting. Then she said no. This isn't about anger, she told them. It's about trust. Some tried to argue. Others sighed in frustration. It was just a dog, one voice said. Her grip tightened on the phone. It was his dog, she replied. And my responsibility. She ended the calls politely but firmly. Contact was cut off. The sister-in-law's number was blocked. Messages were ignored. Boundaries were set clearly and without apology. The quiet that followed felt different than before. This silence did not hurt. It healed. Each day, the dog grew a little stronger. He ate slowly but steadily. He followed her around the house again, just like before. Sometimes he stopped and rested, but he always got back up. Watching him recover reminded her of something important. Love was not passive. It protected. It acted. Late one evening, she stood in the living room, looking at a photo of her husband on the wall. She held the dog's collar in her hands, the familiar worn fabric grounding her. I did right by you, she said softly. The dog rested his head against her leg, as if answering. Choosing protection over peace was not easy, but it was right. And for the first time since everything had fallen apart, she felt steady enough to face what came next. The change did not happen all at once. Healing never does. It came quietly, in small moments that almost went unnoticed. A deeper breath in the morning. A lighter step through the house. A sense that the air itself no longer pressed so hard against her chest. The dog recovered slowly, day by day. His strength returned in pieces. First his appetite. Then his interest in the world outside the window. Then his steady habit of following her again, room to room, just as he always had. Each small improvement felt like a gift. She adjusted her life around his needs without resentment. Short walks replaced long ones. Soft blankets replaced cold floors. Time slowed, and for once, she welcomed it. The backyard changed too. At first, she avoided it. The memory of that night lingered in the air, heavy and sharp. But slowly, she returned. She filled in the disturbed soil. She planted grass where the earth had been torn apart. Life grew back. Soon, the dog began lying in his favorite spot again, stretching out in the sun, eyes half closed. The place that once held fear now held warmth. Survival. Sometimes she sat nearby with a cup of tea, watching him breathe, letting the quiet settle around them. The backyard no longer felt empty. It felt earned. There were still hard days. Grief did not disappear just because the truth came out. She still missed her husband in sudden, aching waves. A song on the radio. A familiar smell. A memory that arrived without warning. But now, those moments did not break her. She had learned something important. Loyalty does not end with death. It lives on in the care we give, in the promises we keep, in the choices we make when no one is watching. The dog had been her husband's shadow for years. Now he was hers. One afternoon, as she brushed his fur gently, she spoke out loud, her voice calm and steady. "We're okay," she said. The dog lifted his head and looked at her, his tail giving a slow, content wag. She smiled. In protecting him, she had found herself again. The betrayal had taken much from her, but it had not taken everything. It had not taken her values. It had not taken her ability to love. If anything, it had sharpened them. She had learned to trust her instincts, to set boundaries without guilt, to choose what mattered over what was easy. And in the quiet moments, she understood something else. Sometimes, the ones we protect end up saving us too. The dog rested his head against her leg, solid and warm. Alive. The future was still uncertain. Life always was. But as the sun dipped low and the backyard filled with soft light, she felt something she had not felt in a long time. Peace. Not because everything had been fixed, but because she had stood firm. She reached down and scratched behind the dog's ears, smiling as he leaned into her touch. Together, they stepped forward. Stronger. Safer. And finally, at home.